Welcome back to another episode of the Ink and Impact podcast. Today, I am pleased to introduce you to James H. Belt, the author of the book Hope Realized: How the Power of Practical and Spiritual Development Can Diminish Poverty and Expose the Lie of Hopelessness. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Aileen. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, glad to have you. So, this title is really weighty, right? Those are
Hmm.
some really important and deep topics. So, let's start off with what led you to write this book.
Yeah, great question. So I started traveling to Nicaragua in 2007. I actually went on a church mission trip down there, and we were visiting an orphanage. And I kind of went, I call myself a reluctant missionary sometimes because I kind of went because my family coaxed me into it. I felt like it was something I should do. Went and fell in love with the country over time. Ended up going back. My family ended up adopting a 15-year-old girl who's now my sister from that same orphanage. And then kind of during that time had the chance to travel down there a little more. And shortly after that, in 2011, I was in Nicaragua visiting the same orphanage and just felt a call in a sense to move there. Literally heard an inaudible words, "Where are you going?" And I could talk a little more about that at some point if you'd like. But that ended up sending me to Nicaragua for 3 years. And during that time, my experience there was that, oftentimes we think of poverty as the things we see at the surface, hunger, lack of education, lack of healthcare, and if you almost think of it like an iceberg, it's what we see at the top, right? But there's something feeding that, and that's what I've found is this sense of hopelessness or lack of real hope. And I talk about it in both a practical and a spiritual sense. So that's where that subtitle came from, is that it's really this hopelessness, or I call it the lie of hopelessness, that feeds a lot of what we see at the top and the surface and think of as poverty. And so as I had that experience, and as I moved back from Nicaragua in 2015, I really felt like it was something I should share. I wasn't sure what that would look like. I didn't know if I was going to be sharing it with my mom and dad or my wife, or maybe some people from my church, or if it would become something more. So I started writing in December 2015, and just kind of literally writing. I was handwriting, and eventually, as it developed, I thought, well, maybe this should be something I can share with others. Maybe it's a message that would make an impact for other people. And so that's kind of how the journey started. And a few years later, got connected to a couple other people to help with outlining, and then eventually with someone to help with publishing. So yeah, that's kind of how we got to today. So it's been a journey. I guess that's
Uh,
what, almost 8 years now.
yeah, I was
So
going to say, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love that everyone has a different experience.
hmm,
There is no one right way to write a
yeah.
book or how long it takes. Um, you know, the audience also here on the Ink and Impact podcast is a Christian writing audience. So I love that you mentioned that, you had this calling to
Hmm,
where, you heard, where are you going?
yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned you'd be willing to talk about that. Go ahead and share a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so I was at this orphanage in this community called El Cañon, and that's where this orphanage Puente de Amistad is located. And El Cañon, unsurprisingly, means the canyon. And so it is in between two large hills. They call them montañas, or mountains. There, I was on a hike with some kids from the orphanage, and we had actually hiked up to the top of this one hill in particular, and it is cleared out. Some farmers had cleared it out, and we were just kind of up there hiking and looking around. And as I was staring off into the distance overlooking El Cañon, I literally felt like I heard something, but it wasn't out loud because I was the only one that heard it. That said, "Where are you going?" And my first thought was, when I heard "Where are you going?" is, I'm going to get on an airplane tomorrow and fly back to my nice life that I have in the United States. I was a financial advisor. I wasn't married at the time, but I had a house, and kind of had some plans mapped out. And it wasn't in my plan to ever live. I was never someone that grew up wanting to be a missionary necessarily. And so, but as I explored that, and really, I talk about it in the book, and Hope Realized, how I had to kind of put my money where my mouth is, or the words that I had said to others, I had to kind of live that out and say, well, do I really believe that real life is found in following God's call? And do I really believe that there's hope for people in Nicaragua? And so as I walked through that process, I decided, well, maybe this is what I'm supposed to do. Maybe this is the next step in my life. And yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up. And then I started to explore in about a year later, I ended up moving down there as I explored the process and figured out what it would look like. And I still continue to do work there with the same organization, NicoWorks, today. So
That's awesome.
yeah,
God definitely has a way of capturing our attention and
yes,
sometimes changing our plans
yes.
to fulfill his greater
Mhm.
plan. And that has obviously, as you mentioned, led you to start kind of writing down your experiences. So initially, you weren't necessarily thinking of writing a book, but
Mhm.
it sounds like once you started talking to other writers, is that when it started thinking, well, hey, I can turn this into a book?
Well, I would say that is when it started to really form into a book. So even prior to talking to other writers, I had, written about 35,000 words down, and I had shared the book with a couple other people. I let a couple people read it. So I got into this point where I felt like I had gotten it to where I could get to on my own. And I was
Okay.
like, kind of by then I had felt like, well, maybe this will be a book. But then I started to talk to someone, kind of found out about an organization that helps with outlining, and they really helped me to think about it. And they kind of confirmed, yes, this could actually be a book. Let me help you think about how to structure it and add some pieces to it so that it gets to a place where you could have a full, chapter book that you could release. And so yeah, so that was kind of the confirmation. One from some people close to me that said, yeah, this message is worthwhile, that it can make a difference. And two, then talking to somebody that has a little more experience, and they said, yeah, just maybe some tweaks and adjustments, which I knew was necessary, that it could become something that you would be proud of. So
Yes. Yes. And so, what was your goal with the book?
yeah, I would say really twofold. One, this message, this idea of hope and overcoming the lie of hopelessness and poverty through hope was something different than maybe my experience had been in addressing poverty. A lot of what I talk about in the book is being done, but looking at it from that perspective was something that I thought was a little bit different and unique. And so I wanted to be able to share that message, and one, to help other people that were in that particular arena, but also to encourage and inspire other people that they can make a difference, that it's not just for the people we often think of as practitioners of maybe alleviating poverty, that anyone can actually make a difference. Anyone can bring someone else hope. We just all have a unique way of doing it. So I would say that, and then also to raise awareness for organizations like NicoWorks that are taking that approach, and actually raise money even for organizations like NicoWorks. So 50% of the proceeds from Hope Realized actually goes back to NicoWorks. So it was an awareness thing as well as just the message itself being very important.
Yes.
So
And so, go ahead and briefly share what is Nika Works.
yeah, so NicoWorks is an organization that works in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is the second poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. And so we focus on bringing hope through both practical and spiritual development. And so practically, we do vocational training, we do some small business development, we have sewing training that we do, some agriculture vocational training, we've developed a bike shop, a number of items such as that. And then we also incorporate discipleship, and sometimes in partnership with churches, discipleship, where we're looking at both sides of it. So we're saying, one, we want to give you a real opportunity, which is the practical hope element of it. But then we also want to help you see yourself differently, see yourself the way that God sees you. And I like to say we want to have a reframed identity, to help you know that you're loved by a God who created you on purpose and for a purpose. And so that's
Mm.
our approach to addressing poverty, particularly in Nicaragua.
Wow, that's so good. That's so good.
Thank you.
And it's, valuable work. I mean, you're definitely
Mm.
making a difference. So I was, you were so kind to provide me with an advanced reader copy of your book. And in your second chapter, which is titled Coffee Farm Wake Up Call, it just really resonated with me as a
Mm.
writer, because I think we often start the book creation process kind of naively thinking that we're just going to churn out a certain number of words a day, we're going to publish within a year, and
Mm.
the book's just going to sell itself, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's rarely ever that easy or methodical or our plans, as you already mentioned, don't always turn out the way we intend them to do. So I just really thought that was very interesting how it ties in with us as writers as well.
Huh. That's a great point. Yeah, that was a unique experience,
Yeah.
being out in the mountains and in Nicaragua in this rural village. And this is before I even lived there. So really my first experience outside of El Cañon with trying to think about, okay, what does God have for me? One, maybe in this country, but also how does poverty exist and how can I make a difference? And I don't know if you want me to get into the story, but the coffee farmers were out there, and I kind of accidentally promised that I was going to help them sell all their coffee to Starbucks. And so um it's a little more complicated than
Yeah.
my 20 something year old self thought at the time.
Yeah.
And
And
so I
you
get
weren't
him.
even a barista at Starbucks, were
I
you?
was nothing. I liked coffee. I They were nice enough to email me back though and explain the process, which involved like sending the beans to Switzerland and some kind of special packaging. I'm pretty sure I'd already ruined the process at that point. So I had to let them know, these coffee farmers know, that I was not quite able to do what I wanted to do. Yeah, and it was really a wake-up call, but in a good way, because when I went back with a much more, I would say, humble, but also, open attitude of just like, I have a lot to learn, which
Mm.
I think is super applicable, right, to the writing process, is having that open perspective. I mean, I know there were days when I was writing and I had the same experience, especially once I got to the publishing part of it, where I was like, okay, this is going to go X way. And, it was a journey getting to even to the place where I was like, okay, this is how I'm going to publish. But,
Right.
um, and then going through they told me when I started getting to the point of, okay, we're going to edit and go through all of that, and then go through marketing. It's like, you did the first marathon, now you have
Yes.
kind of like another marathon and a half to go.
You're
Like,
you're
okay,
doing the
what?
ultra marathon now.
Wait a
Yes.
minute. So yeah, that's definitely, and so it was a wake-up call, but a good one. It's been a neat journey going through from where I started with the book, and I still have the journal I started with, that I
Right.
started writing it down by hand, to where it is today. It's just been, really neat. And I've learned a lot. I've even learned more about hope, and it's been reinforced. The words in the book have been reinforced to me through the process. So
Right. Yeah. So, you know, anyone listening, there will be discouraging moments, but don't give up, right? It takes
yeah.
tenacity. It takes continuing to, step out in faith and put in the work. But there is a great reward in the end.
Mm.
So you kind of alluded to it being a process. So I'm guessing there were some challenges along your writing journey. Is there anything that you can share with us as one or two of those challenges?
Sure. Yeah. I would say first, I have a full-time job. I run a business, actually. And so one challenge was finding time to write, in the process. So I started in December 2015. My first child was born in November of 2016, and then my second child was born in 2018. So I was running a business and had some other stuff going on, and I just had to find time to write. And it's interesting. I've talked to other people. I've heard other people talk about how we get this picture in our mind of what it looks like to be a writer, and we go to a cabin, and and it's, that's great maybe for some people, and can be a great way to do it, I would imagine, but just wasn't my journey. And so I had to find time in the midst of my day, whether it was waking up early or just finding a little extra time to write. And I would just take, chunks of time, and I might have a little bit of a word goal, but I wouldn't beat myself up if I wouldn't get there. So that was my first challenge, I would say, is getting there. And then the second challenge was, kind of deciding, okay, well, what does publishing look like for me? I had in my mind, I was going to go, find a pretty large publisher, and it was going to be this whole process. And so I started to explore what that looked like. And I'd ask myself, um, one, is that super important to me? And do I want to take the time that it would be necessary for me to do it? I believed I could probably do it, but it was going to take years before I could get the book out. So what was most important to me? And to me, getting the message out at that moment, and then being able to use that message and share it with others, was more important to me, than waiting for me to get the big publishing deal. So I ended up going, more of the self-published route, with working with an organization that helped me do it. But that was my journey because I felt like that was more important to me. So that was a challenge, though, was getting over the hump of saying, I don't have to do it this way, uh, and being kind of ready to do it that way. So that was a couple of them. And then marketing was challenging. And yeah, I mean, there's more I could go into, but
Well, and
it
I
was
think
good.
finding the time to write is a big one, yeah, especially when you have another job and
Yes.
family responsibilities. That's
Hmm.
huge. So yeah, just that consistency of just even 30 minutes a day, whatever you can squeeze in, it all
Yes.
helps to move the book forward. So
Yeah.
yeah.
If I could share one more challenge, actually,
Yes.
it just popped in my head that I think could be really valuable to people is, I would get caught up in the writing process with how's it going to sound. And I think it's important to have a reader in mind, right, that you're writing to, but not to get too caught up in the perfection of it in that moment, because you'll just get stymied, and you won't be able to write if you're stuck there. And so I had to kind of say, okay, like, I'll go back and look at that later. Let me keep going and let it flow a little bit, and not worry so much about having the exact right word at that moment.
Yes, that is a great reminder to everyone because I'm a recovering people pleaser and perfectionist.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's hard for me too, but to just
Mm,
push through and keep writing because you can always go back and edit, but you can't
exactly.
edit what you don't have written.
Yeah,
So
that's a great way to put it. I love that.
yeah, yeah. So you've mentioned that everyone can offer hope in some
Mm.
way, and I was hoping that maybe you'd share a little bit about that with our listeners.
Yeah, so actually, when I was in Nicaragua, even early on, we had visited an orphanage there, and it was great. We played with kids and hung out with them, and I was able to invest in the kids. But at the same time, my background was in finance and business, and I wasn't really sure what my role was. It wasn't, I kind of saw this is what it means to be a missionary. This is what it means to be on a mission trip, and what I realized after I went through that process and really thought about it more was that no, what I have to offer, what I bring to the table can actually make a difference. And it doesn't have to look exactly like what maybe the person that I'm in front of, or what my image, if it's Mother Teresa, if it's whoever you imagine as the person that you think of when you're thinking of bringing hope to someone, that when we look at and say, well, what do I do? What do I have to offer? What are my experiences? What are my gifts? That more than likely, whether it's for one person or a lot of people, you can play a role in someone's life. You can bring hope to them. You might have, whether that's practical hope, maybe you can give someone a job, maybe you can, do, I don't know, ESL classes. There's lots of ways practically, obviously, to bring hope, or it's just encouraging someone. And it doesn't have to be somebody in poverty. It could be, a friend that really needs someone to remind them that they're loved by a God who created them on purpose and for a purpose. And so, we get caught up maybe in the it has to look like this, and we don't take that step. And I think sometimes we also get caught up in believing, is there really hope? And that's another part I try to address in the book, is reminding people, no, there is. It doesn't always look easier or simple, but but there is really truly hope.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And for us as writers, it's a great opportunity for us to offer hope to our readers, whether we're writing
Mm,
fiction or nonfiction.
yeah.
Um, you know, everyone is so desperate these days to, whether they're willing to recognize it or not, they are looking for peace and comfort and hope. And as Christians, we know where the ultimate source of that lies. And
Yes.
so to incorporate that into our books in some way is really not only providing them with hope, but life. So
Mm,
I just think that's so important for us to keep in mind as writers.
yeah. No, I love that.
Yeah. So I liked your dedication actually as well, and I'll share that here. It says, to those who are waiting for their chance to experience real hope and those who are committed to bringing them hope, no
Mm,
one is truly hopeless. So I just think that's really, really good. And again,
thank you.
ties in
Yeah.
to writing. So
No, and it was really in that process of writing that that kind of came out to me, is, this idea of hopelessness, and how I kind of like, no, I don't, no, it's a lie of hope. No one's truly hopeless, and in Christ, certainly no one's truly hopeless. Right. So,
but we can feel that way,
oh
right?
yeah,
And
we
it's
can be
not to
taught there.
diminish the feelings,
Oh no,
but to switch the mindset, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I can feel that way still today
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
So something else you mentioned in the book is all in hope. So how is
Mm.
that different from just general hope?
Yeah. So, all in hope, the way I like to look at it is it's both practical and it's spiritual. And I talk about how even Jesus, I think, brought hope in this way, right? He brought practical hope, healing, things of that sort. And then he brought spiritual hope, which ultimately, is the ultimate hope, but it's reframing your identity and saying, no, look, God loves you and he created you on purpose and for a purpose. And so when I think of all in hope, and I think of bringing hope to others, particularly people in situations such as poverty, it's bringing both of those things to the table. That's when you bring them both to the table, that's when hope is really super powerful. When it's not just, hey, God loves you, he created you on purpose and for a purpose, and then you walk away and you're like, well, I hope they figure out something to do with it,
Right.
and that's important. That's not to diminish that message at all. But if I'm in the middle of El Cañon in a village where people make less than $2 a day, if that's my approach, and I kind of say as a Christ follower that, hey, this is an important message, but I'm not going to do anything to help your current situation, I'm not sure that's a complete picture of hope. And so when it's adding that practical in, or you could do it the other way around, adding the spiritual in from the other perspective, but adding that practical in and say, no, I'm willing to invest. I'm willing to go in for the long term and say, not only do I believe you were created on purpose and for a purpose by a God who loves you, I believe it so much that I'm willing to help give you an opportunity to live that out. And that's how I think of it from a practical standpoint, is saying, I believe there's hope for today and hope forever. So the hope for today is that practical, maybe, if you think about it that way.
Mm.
And that hope forever isn't a get rich quick scheme, but it does, I think, change the way you see your life. And that's super important. So
Mm. I love that. So good.
thank you.
So, most writers, we want to make a difference, which is a lot of times why we start out writing a book. How can we, as writers, make sure that that comes through in our books? What's that process like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, it was really helpful to really get curious. And what I mean by that is get curious about my own story. So when I thought about hope, I thought about, well, where did I see all in hope? Where did I see practical hope? Where did I see spiritual hope? And where did I see hopelessness in my journey? And I talk about that a little bit in my book, is examining my own story and saying, well, how did I get to where I am today? Because another tenet I would say of the book and my belief is that I'm not, I'm a product of that hope in a sense. Like, I'm not better or more important than someone in Nicaragua. I've just been given opportunities and investment in different ways that has allowed me to be at the place that I'm in. So how did that happen for me? That was super important. So getting curious about that, and then getting curious about the issue or the topic that you're talking about. So looking at other perspectives on it, looking at how it's played out in other ways. I had the opportunity to read some other books that talked about hope, and even from people that weren't coming at it from a spiritual standpoint, but just looking at, okay, well, hope does make a difference, even in a maybe in a more secular sense, but I know where that hope's ultimately coming from,
Right.
From my perspective. So that's super important. And then thinking about what do you have to offer? So I talk about, like, what do you bring to the table? So expressing that. So in my journey, I was able to talk about, how I was able to make a difference. And I think talking about your experience, or looking at yourself, your story, and then talking about, if you're writing, maybe from the type of book that I wrote, at least looking at, okay, how did I make a difference with the gifts that I've been given? So helping maybe that person see themselves in the story by seeing it through you, is, I think, super helpful. So saying, okay, in my case, I was able to bring my business experience and things of that sort, and I was able to spell that journey out a little bit, and then ask the reader, hey, well, what might that look like for you? And I think that can be really helpful in the process. And then I think connecting that reader to a way that they can make a difference. So kind of saying, okay, well, here's some ways that you can make an impact, giving examples of particular ways that they could do it. In the book, I talk about getting connected to different people, and so connecting the reader with some practical steps that they can take on their own to make a difference. And so, and again, in my case, that was bringing hope to others, but in someone else's case, that might look different, depending on the topic of the book. And, I would imagine, I've never written a fiction book, but I would imagine there's some takeaways from that as well.
Yeah.
depending on the way you're writing. And then I would say just encourage the reader to take a step. And that might mean you taking a step as a writer too. And giving examples of that, but being encouraging and kind of empowering that reader. One thing that someone told me that helped with the outlining of the book that was super helpful was the idea of story loop, and then even the idea of having an all is lost moment, where you're saying, okay, well, if we don't take this step, what's going to happen? And then at the end, kind of encouraging and saying, painting the picture for, well, if we do take this step, what's possible? And that, I think, is really important, is to say, okay, well, hey, there's stakes here. But there's also this part where if we do take this step, you can be a part of making change happen. And so that's the way I like to think of. Get curious, look at what do you bring to the table, connect the reader, or get connected, and then encourage the reader to take a step. And I would say the same thing, in the writing process. Oftentimes maybe that last one in particular is take a step, just do something. So
Yes. Every little step helps. And
Yep.
those are excellent points. I'm
Oh,
glad that
thank you.
you touched on each of those. And especially love the curiosity part.
Yes.
Sometimes we could just come to the table, I'm just going to share this, this, and this, and leave it
Mm,
at that. But to be curious, okay, what else can I go deeper here?
yeah.
Yeah, so that's really, really good. And I think too, when we as writers set out to write a book and we want to make a difference, a lot of times we have the big goal of, I want to change people's lives, right?
Uh-huh.
But it doesn't have to be a life-changing difference that we
Mm,
make. And
yeah.
I forget which chapter it was, but there was a quote that you have in your book, and it says, quite frankly, it is not your job to change people. Our role is to create openings for people to
Mm,
find real opportunities and reframed identities.
yeah.
That is so, so good, and so important for us to remember that, yeah, we don't have to make them change, all at once, some big, huge difference that we can visually even see.
Hmm.
But that one, like I've pointed out a couple of quotes from your book, those one sentences or that paragraph or that just one thought that you share might really get them to think and over time make that difference in their lives, right?
No, that's so true. Yeah. And I think, like you said, opening, or, in the book, the quote, but opening the door, creating the environment where that can happen, I think, is where, and as a book, as a writer, there's a huge opportunity there
Yeah.
to help someone take the words that you wrote and translate it into their life and allow that to work. And it might work completely different than you even thought, but
Right. And it
it's
might
a
work
huge
differently for
opportunity.
different people, right? So
Exactly.
one
Yep.
reader will get this out of page 7, the other
Yeah.
person will skim over it, but wow, on page 25, that really spoke to them.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Very true. I love that.
yeah, yeah. So, we've been talking about how our books can impact others and make a difference. And one thing that I like to ask my guests is, what is a book that has impacted you in your life, in addition to the Bible, of course?
Yeah. Yeah, there's two that come to mind, and the first one is a book that's by Dallas Willard. It's called Renovation of the Heart, and it talks about how some of the idea of the iceberg with poverty actually was born out of that, on his perspective on how a lot of what comes out of us, it comes from within, and so it's looking at, real change comes from the heart, allowing God to change your heart, and ultimately that's what changes. So that's been a huge impact in my life. And then just recently, I listened to the audiobook of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which was really interesting. It's his experience and his writings from his time in a concentration camp, and then what he took from that, and how meaning and hope plays a role in people. And as I listened to that, this was just like maybe a week ago. It just reiterated the importance of hope. And again, he's maybe not coming from the exact same perspective in the book as I am, but he's talking about a greater sense of hope than just the hope for the moment, and how that has power to push people through and create persistence and resiliency and hope for something beyond the immediate circumstances. And so it's just a reiteration of that from someone that obviously went through a terrible situation. So yeah, it was great. And it was just another way to remind me that I can bring hope to others and how important that is.
Oh,
So
those are
yeah,
great recommendations.
thank you.
Oh, so I know you've shared a ton of value already, but I didn't know if there was anything else you'd like to share or anything you'd particularly like to reiterate before we conclude our conversation today.
Yeah, I would just say that two things maybe. One, that you had said earlier that no one's truly hopeless, and I think that's a real belief of mine that we can feel hopeless, and it's important to recognize that reality and that hopelessness has power, right? But that it doesn't have to win. It's not the end of the story.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say too that we all have an opportunity to make a difference. And I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking it has to be something um, big and it has to start here. And I know I can get in that mindset. I tend to dream about, okay, well, what if this happens? But oftentimes it just starts with taking that one single step. And I think that's super important as a writer, as we were talking about. It's you're gonna have a book maybe eventually, but maybe right now you have a blank page in front of you. It's just taking that step of saying, hey, I'm going to start writing. And that's what happened to me. It's probably somewhere around here, actually, the journal that I have, but it was a blank page, and it was a dream at one point. And then, that was now 8 years later, it's a book. And sometimes it's just taking that first step that allows us to figure out and allows God to open the door for whatever that next step is. And so I just encourage people, you can make a difference and take that first step and the rest will start to become more clear.
Mm. Thank you for that. That definitely is encouragement. So I know that many of our listeners will want to connect with you and learn more about you and your book. How can they do that?
Yeah, you can go to my website, jameshbelt.com, and you can find more information on my book and other resources. You can pick up my book on Amazon, really anywhere you can find it online, and you can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, James Belt. So if you look for me there, I'm
Wonderful.
sharing as well.
Fantastic. And I'll be sharing those links also in the show notes. So listeners can just go quickly to their phone and click on those as well. So
Awesome.
thank you so much for joining us today, James.
Thank you, Daily. It was so nice.